Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Let's drift once again into the quiet landscape of ancient Egypt, where the morning sun rises slowly over the river and the temples cast long, peaceful shadows across the sand. Everything here feels familiar. Now the steady rhythm of belief, the gentle presence of gods, the calm logic that shaped daily life. We move forward without rush, as if the past itself is guiding us by the hand, inviting us to take another slow step into its endless corridors. In this part, we settle deeper into the world of temples, rituals, symbols, and the subtle ways Egyptians understood divinity. We've explored myths and gods, the afterlife, cosmic geography, magic, medicine, kingship, and daily life. Now we drift toward the heart of Egyptian thought, the quiet belief that the divine existed not only above or beyond, but within the world itself. Every stone, every grain of sand, every cloud reflected a divine idea. Their gods were embedded in the structure of reality. So much so that understanding the world meant understanding the gods. Let's begin by easing ourselves into the symbolism of creation once more. Egyptians had several creation myths, but they weren't contradictory. They coexisted like overlapping memories, each offering a different angle on the same quiet truth. In Hermopolis, creation began with 8 primordial deities, the Ogdoad who represented the elements of chaos. Before the world formed, darkness, water, hiddenness, and infinity, each in balanced male-female pairs. These gods weren't chaotic beings. They simply represented the quiet potential before creation took shape. When the time was right, the primeval mound rose from the waters, and a lotus blossomed on it. From that lotus emerged a young god, often identified as the sun. The image is soft and serene, a flower opening at dawn to reveal light in Heliopolis. Creation came through Atum, who brought himself into existence out of Nun's waters. His act of creation was not fiery or dramatic. It was deliberate, reflective, a slow unfolding. Atum generated Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, who then produced Geb and Nut, earth and sky. From their union came the gods who shaped the world. This myth, too, wasn't meant to be taken literally, but understood symbolically. Every dawn, every flood, every spring season was seen as a gentle reenactment of creation. In Memphis, a different story described creation through thought and word. Ptah, the craftsman god, imagined the world and spoke it into being. A calm, thoughtful process. Egyptians respected the idea that thinking and speaking held power. You didn't need lightning bolts or cosmic battles to make the world. A quiet mind and a precise voice were enough. Each creation story emphasized order emerging from calm stillness, not from violence. That was the Egyptian worldview. The universe began with quiet and shoulds, remain in quiet balance. Now let's drift into the specific objects inside temples, because each item carried meaning. The central object in any temple was the statue of the god. But this statue wasn't just a decorative item. Egyptians believed the statue housed the divine presence after rituals were performed. The statue wasn't alive in a physical sense, but spiritually it held the essence of the god. Priests didn't display these statues openly. They kept them in the sanctuary, a dark, quiet chamber where only purified priests entered. Each morning, priests woke the god's statue, cleansed it, dressed it, applied oils, and offered food. The ceremony was gentle and familiar, like caring for an honored guest. Even the gods appreciated good hospitality. Offerings filled Egyptian temples daily. Bread, beer, wine, incense, meat, fruit, and water. The offerings weren't about feeding the gods physical nourishment. They were symbolic gestures maintaining the bond between humanity and the divine. After priests placed the offerings, they recited ritual texts explaining each item. The tone wasn't dramatic. It was steady, respectful, almost like reading step by step. Instructions on maintaining universal harmony. We now move slowly to an essential part of ritual life: incense. Egyptians believed incense carried prayers upward. The most sacred incense was kifi, made from a blend of ingredients like honey, wine, myrrh, cinnamon, juniper, and resins. The recipe was written with ritual instructions that required care, patience, and timing. Kifi wasn't just a scent. It symbolized purification, healing, and connection to the gods. Burning it filled temple halls with sweet smoke that drifted up like quiet offerings of its own. Let's turn gently toward the sacred instruments used in rituals. The sistrum, a handheld rattle, was associated with Hathor. Its soft metallic sound was believed to drive away unpleasant forces. The Egyptians weren't particularly fond of chaos or noise, but they allowed certain gentle sounds into their temples. The sistrum's soft rattling felt appropriate, controlled, rhythmic, reassuring. Another instrument, the menet necklace, was shaken similarly to bring blessings. These sounds weren't performances. They were spiritual vibrations, subtle reminders of harmony. Now we drift into the concept of Heka, which we touched on before but will now explore with more depth. Heka wasn't magic in the modern sense. It was a cosmic force present at creation, used by gods and humans alike. Heka animated the world, flowing through rituals, spoken words, symbols, and actions. The Egyptians didn't separate magic from religion or science. To them, everything connected under one subtle system. A surgeon setting a bone used Heka. A priest performing a ritual used Heka. A farmer praying over his field used Heka. It wasn't an act of desperation. It was a tool for maintaining balance. Scribes played a major role in keeping Heka alive, writing texts with care because the very act of writing maintained the order of the universe. Their ink strokes preserved names, prayers, rituals, and knowledge. Papyrus scrolls weren't just documents. They were vessels of life and memory. Now, let's drift toward the great libraries and archives. Egyptians kept vast collections of scrolls, medical treatises, astronomical observations, hymns, myths, legal records, and ritual texts. These archives reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. Priests read these texts with reverence, not because they worshipped books, but because they believed knowledge carried divine power. Silence usually filled these spaces. The only sounds were red pens brushing papyrus and the occasional distant rustle of linen robes. Let's wander a bit into the world of Egyptian art again, but from another angle. We explored color and symbolism before. Now we focus on perspective. Egyptian artists didn't aim for realism. They aimed for meaning. Bodies were shown with heads in profile, eyes frontal, shoulders squared, legs stepping forward, all arranged in ways that felt right to Egyptians. To them, this wasn't unnatural. It was the clearest way to show the essential truth of a person or a god, and everything had to be clear. Gods needed their attributes. A falcon head meant Horus or Rohoricti. A jackal head meant Anubis. A lioness head meant Sekhmet, or another fierce goddess. A cow's horns framed the sun disk of Hathor. These symbols were not confusing but comforting. They provided order, much like labels on shelves. Let's drift into the sacred animals again. Egyptians mummified not only cats and crocodiles, but also ibises, baboons, fish, snakes, bulls, and more. These animal mummies weren't pets or mascots. They carried symbolic weight, connecting people to divine forces. Some animals lived pampered lives in temple precincts. Others were bred specifically for ritual offerings. The process reflected the Egyptians' layered understanding of sacredness. You didn't worship the animal itself, you honored what the animal represented. Now let's explore the concept of duality, because it shaped almost everything in Egyptian thought. They saw the world in pairs that complemented each other, day and night, life and death, order and disorder, Upper and Lower Egypt, male and female deities, earth and sky. The Egyptians didn't view these dualities as opposites locked in conflict. They saw them as partners. You needed both sides for balance. Without night, the sun had nowhere to rest. Without disorder, order couldn't be restored. Without the desert, the fertile land wouldn't be defined. Even their hieroglyphs relied on balanced symmetry, pairing, direction, proportion. This balanced worldview shaped how they viewed the gods. Many major deities existed with male and female counterparts, or as combinations of multiple aspects. Amun could merge with Ra, Horus could merge with Sobek. Hathor could merge with Sekhmet or Isis. The Egyptians believed gods revealed themselves through many forms. Just as the world revealed itself through many cycles, change was not a contradiction. It was an expression of divine complexity. Let's move quietly to a fascinating topic: sacred geography. Egyptians believed certain places were naturally closer to divine energy. Some were locations of mythic events. Some were sources of natural wonder. Some simply felt sacred to them. The temple of Abydos was seen as the gateway to the afterlife. The island of Philae was sacred to Isis. The cataracts of the Nile were linked to Khnum. The desert cliffs near Thebes whispered of the presence of Hathor. Pilgrims traveled to these places not with loud ceremonies, but with humble steps, offering prayers, incense, and sometimes just their presence. Now let's drift into personal devotion. Ordinary Egyptians didn't always have access to grand temples, but they still practiced quiet worship at home. They kept small shrines with images of gods or protective symbols. They lit lamps. They placed offerings of bread, water, flowers, or small wooden figures. They whispered prayers while preparing meals or tending gardens. They believed the gods listened gently, without needing elaborate ceremonies. Families asked for protection, health, fertility, success in work, and safe childbirth. Religion wasn't separate from their routine. It lived in the soft corners of daily life. Let's now explore priestly festivals in more detail, because they were among the few times when the gods came out into public view. During major festivals, priests carried statues of gods in portable shrines on decorated boats or processional barks. Crowds gathered along temple avenues, singing soft hymns, clapping, or silently watching. The passing shrine created a moment of shared stillness and acknowledgement that the divine walked among them. Festivals often included feasting, music, and quiet celebration. Egyptians enjoyed these moments, but not in chaotic ways. Their joy had structure. One of the most important festivals was Opet, celebrated in Thebes. The statue of Ammon traveled from Karnak to Luxor. The journey symbolized renewal. The king participated to receive divine strength. Crowds gathered in shaded streets. Priests chanted. Musicians played. The procession moved, slowly, no rush, no urgency, just steady movement beneath the bright sky. Now we turn gently to theology, because Egyptian priests did think deeply about the nature of gods, even if they didn't express it in modern philosophical terms. In some temple texts, gods were described as manifestations of one hidden divine essence. Each deity was like a ray of a larger light. Priests in Thebes praised Amen as one who makes himself into millions, meaning he appeared in countless forms throughout creation. This wasn't a contradiction to polytheism. It was an expansion of it. The Egyptians were comfortable with layered truth. In Memphis, clergy viewed Ptah as the mind behind creation. In Heliopolis, Atum was the source. In Thebes, Amen was the transcendent force. Each center emphasized a different perspective, but no one argued that only one was correct. The Egyptians didn't force their gods into rigid boxes. They let them flow like the Nile. Let's drift into the final movement of this part, the Egyptian understanding of eternity. To them, eternity wasn't a distant future. It existed alongside the present. The dead lived among the living. Dreams crossed boundaries, rituals connected worlds, and divine presence moved through daily life. The afterlife wasn't a far-off realm. It was simply another field, another river, another home, the field of reeds. The ideal afterlife looked very much like Egypt: canals, fields, palm trees, houses, and gentle breezes. People believed they would farm, feast, talk, and live peacefully, not in boredom, but in simplicity. Their ideal eternity was a continuation of their best moments on earth, still standing in the warm quiet of ancient Egypt, surrounded by gods who whisper rather than shout, rituals that calm rather than excite, and a worldview built on balance rather than conflict. Let's move gently into the next stretch of this long, slow journey where the sands feel warmer, the temple walls rise taller, and the presence of the gods settles over the landscape like a soft blanket of evening light. We return to ancient Egypt once more, walking at the same unhurried pace the Egyptians themselves preferred. Nothing changes too quickly here. Even ideas seem to wait patiently for us to arrive. In this part, we drift deeper into the world of divine images, sacred practices, unusual cults, and the everyday ways Egyptians tried to understand the mysteries of life. Their world was calm on the surface, yet rich with symbolic meaning just beneath it. Everything had layers, rituals, objects, myths, even daily chores. By peeling back these layers slowly, we begin to see how the Egyptians built a spiritual system more intricate than it first appears, though still wrapped in the same gentle rhythm we've been following all along. We begin this part with the concept of divine statues, because they were central to temple life. Egyptians didn't think of these statues as decorative. They believed they were living containers for divine presence once rituals activated them. This didn't mean the statues literally walked around at night. Egyptians were symbolic thinkers, not literalists, but they believed the god's spirit dwelled within the statue, listening, observing, and responding in subtle, quiet ways. Most divine statues were made of wood, covered with gold leaf, inlaid with precious stones, and wrapped in linen garments. They were small enough to be carried during festivals, but heavy enough to feel important. Only priests could see the statues. Even the king rarely entered the inner sanctuary. Worshippers interacted with the gods through offerings placed before these statues or through prayers spoken at temple gates. Imagine standing before a massive pylon gate, sunlight warming the sandstone, incense drifting from within, and knowing the god's presence resided just beyond the next few rooms, shrouded in sacred darkness. The experience wasn't about spectacle. It was about quiet connection. Let's drift into the idea of oracles. Because Egyptians didn't rely on direct visions or dramatic revelations. They preferred calm, structured divination. One common method involved carrying the god's statue in a portable shrine during festivals. Priests held the shrine on their shoulders, walking slowly. Individuals approached with questions written on astraca flakes of pottery such as, "Is my neighbor responsible for my missing goat? Or should I take this job?" The priests turned slowly, left or right, to signal yes or no. It wasn't the priests answering. It was believed to be the god choosing direction, a very low-drama method of divine communication, and probably much easier to interpret than some modern alternatives. Now, let's wander toward the world of sacred animals again, but with more focus on how these cults worked. Some animals weren't just representations, they were considered earthly manifestations of gods. The Apis bull in Memphis, for example, was believed to be the living embodiment of Ptah. Priests observed the herd carefully, and when a calf with specific markings was born, they recognized him as the next Apis. He lived in a comfortable environment, fed the best food, and attended ceremonies. When he died, he was mummified with extraordinary care and buried in the Serapeum, a long underground gallery lined with massive stone sarcophagi. Each burial was a quiet yet significant event. In Thebes, the goddess Mut was associated with sacred geese. In Bubastis, Bastit's temple housed honored cats. In Crocodilopolis, that's the real name, priests cared for sacred crocodiles belonging to Sobek. These crocodiles wore jewelry, which is either charming or alarming, depending on how you feel about crocodiles in accessories. But to Egyptians, it simply reflected divine energy taking earthly form. Now let's drift slowly toward some of the lesser-known gods. While names like Ra, Isis, Osiris, and Horus dominate popular imagination, Egyptian religion was full of quieter deities who served specific roles. For example, Shai represented fate, not in a dramatic, destiny-shaping way, but more like the gentle idea that every person had a course laid out for them at birth. Renanutet was the goddess of nourishment and harvest, depicted as a cobra. Farmers honored her during the ripening of grain. She wasn't a goddess of storms or miracles. She was a goddess of timing. If the wheat ripened quietly and steadily, that was her work. Another figure was Hecate, the frog goddess of birth and fertility. Midwives wore amulets of Hecate. Her presence symbolized life emerging from watery chaos. The frog shape made sense in Egypt. Frogs appeared after the flood, signaling renewal. Even their croaking probably sounded reassuring after months of dry heat. Sopdu was a protector of the eastern desert. Khonsu, a moon god, represented the passing of time at night. Neith, a primal goddess from the delta, represented creation, weaving. And war, though her war aspect was more about protection than conquest. Many of these gods faded in and out of prominence, depending on local needs. The Egyptians didn't retire old gods. They simply adjusted their presence. A very accommodating system. Now let's drift into sacred texts. We've touched on the Book of the Dead, but there were many others. The coffin texts, used in the Middle Kingdom, contained spells to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. They were written inside coffins, creating a protective shell of words around the dead. Before that, the pyramid texts served a similar function for kings. These oldest spells were carved into stone walls with steady, deliberate hieroglyphs. These texts weren't dramatic stories. They were more like quiet instructions, ritual passwords, polite requests, poetic affirmations, gentle encouragements. They taught the deceased how to speak before divine judges, how to recognize helpful spirits, and how to avoid obstacles. The tone of the texts is calm and practical, almost as if the Egyptians approached the afterlife like a well-organized trip rather than a terrifying ordeal. Let's drift now into the world of sacred architecture again, focusing on one important feature: pylons. These massive gateway structures symbolized the horizon, the place where the sun rose between two mountains. Passing through a pylon symbolized entering sacred space. The Egyptians didn't run through these gates. They walked carefully, aware of the shift from the earthly world to the divine one. Inside temples, columns often resembled papyrus stalks or lotus buds. Ceilings painted with stars reminded priests of Nut's sky body stretching above them. Floors symbolized the earth. Sacred lakes reflected the sky, turning temples into miniature cosmologies. The more you study Egyptian temples, the more you feel they weren't buildings but three-dimensional prayers. Now let's explore something subtler: temple economics. Temples weren't only places of worship. They were major economic centers. They owned fields, livestock, workshops, ships, and granaries. Priests managed a significant portion of Egypt's resources. But this management wasn't chaotic. It followed the same slow, detail-oriented approach we see everywhere else. Offerings, taxes, trade, and labor flowed through temples with steady organization. In return, temples provided spiritual and sometimes practical support to local communities. Let's drift into another topic: Egyptian clothing and its connection to purity. Clothing wasn't heavily decorated for most people. Priests wore white linen, symbolizing purity. They cleaned their garments often. Linen itself was associated with the goddess Neith and with regeneration. Even everyday clothing tied into spiritual meaning. People didn't think of purity as a single moment. They saw it as a continuous state, something kept through daily habits. Now let's wander gently toward the mysterious subject of sacred texts known as the Books of the Netherworld. These were elaborate illustrations painted on royal tomb walls, showing the journey of the sun through various realms. The books like the Amduat and the Book of Gates depicted strange landscapes filled with serpents, lions, spirits, and guardians. But the tone wasn't frightening. The images were orderly, segmented, and explained through captions. Everything had a place. Ra moved through each hour calmly, assisted by gods who performed their roles without complaint. Even monstrous beings appeared in neat rows, performing their duties. The underworld was not chaos, was structure now. We drift toward the subject of family religion. Egyptians believed the home was a sacred space. Families invoked protective deities like Base to guard their rooms. Couples prayed to Hathor for affection and stability. Mothers prayed to Tauret for safe childbirth. Small statues sat on shelves. Falcons, cats, frogs, dwarves, sun discs. These were not idols to be worshipped with fear. They were friendly presences, companions, silent helpers. Children grew up surrounded by these symbols. They learned stories of the gods in gentle, rhythmic ways. They watched their parents offer water to ancestors. They played games that taught cosmic principles, though the children were probably more focused on winning. Over time, these daily habits formed their worldview. Let's glide toward another gentle subject, ethics. Egyptians didn't have long philosophical treatises about morality, but their wisdom texts reflect a calm, grounded approach to life. The instruction of Tehotep advises humility, patience, generosity, and measured speech. Do not rush when you speak, it says. Another text warns against becoming angry with the weak, because God loves the one who listens. The principle of Mat guided everything: truth, balance, fairness. It was not something enforced by fear, but something lived through habit. We can wander next into the quiet world of craftsmen and artisans. They believed their skills were gifts from Ptah, workmen in Deir el-Medina, who built royal tombs, lived in a community of scribes, painters, carvers, and laborers. They worked in teams, not rushing. Each line of hieroglyphs was carved carefully, each color applied patiently. Their work aimed not at realism, but at eternal clarity. Tombs were filled with scenes of the deceased receiving offerings, traveling peacefully, or sitting under trees. The images weren't meant to impress. They were meant to soothe the soul forever. Let's drift now into mythology again, this time to stories of transformation. Egyptians believed gods could change forms for specific purposes. Ra could become a cat to defeat a serpent. Isis could become a kite bird to revive Osiris. Horus could become a child or a warrior. These transformations weren't chaotic shapeshift. They reflected the idea that divine forces adapt to circumstances, just as the Nile changes with the seasons. Another fascinating figure is the goddess Sesh, patroness of writing, architecture, and measurements. She wore a star-shaped emblem on her head. Egyptians believed she recorded the lifespan of kings and helped establish temple foundations. During foundation ceremonies, a ritual called stretching the cord took place, where priests used ropes to align buildings with astronomical points. Seshat symbolized precision. Her calm presence guided every measurement. Let's drift into festivals again, this time focusing on the quieter, more domestic ones. Some celebrations involved honoring ancestors. Families gathered, shared food, lit lamps, and remembered loved ones. The boundary between living and dead softened during these moments. The Egyptians didn't fear the dead. They respected them as part of the family. One particularly gentle festival honored Hathor in her role as the Lady of the Sycamore. Egyptians believed she appeared in desert shade, offering water to the thirsty. In art, she emerges from a tree handing a jug of water to the deceased, a comforting image showing divine kindness in its simplest form. Now let's turn toward the landscape again. The Nile marshes were not merely pretty scenery. They were symbols of creation, green, fertile, full of life. Boats gliding through reeds represented calm journeys. Egyptians spent time fishing, hunting, and gathering papyrus in these marshes. Their art shows scenes of people navigating through lush greenery with effortless grace. Even their hunting scenes feel unhurried. And now, as we float deep into the core of Egyptian belief, we arrive at an important idea. Gods were not distant beings demanding worship. They were participants in the world. They needed humans to perform rituals, just as humans needed them to maintain cosmic order. This mutual dependence formed a gentle partnership. Egyptians didn't fear their gods. They respected them, honored them, and sought harmony with them. We stand in a world where divine presence feels soft, constant, and woven into every part of life. A world where rituals keep the universe steady. A world where gods whisper, symbols guide, and the rhythm of daily existence flows like the Nile. Let's drift quietly into the next stretch of our long, soft journey through ancient Egypt, where the wind feels a little gentler, the sand seems a little lighter, and the temples stand with the same patient dignity they've held for thousands of years. We move forward at the usual calm pace, never rushing, never disturbing the stillness that wraps itself around the ancient world like a warm linen shroud. Everything here is slow, contemplative, steady. Even the gods seem to breathe in long intervals. In this part, we continue wandering through the deeper layers of Egyptian belief, layers that aren't always obvious, but become clearer when you sit with them quietly, the way ancient Egyptians did. We'll drift through rituals, symbols, sacred objects, funerary traditions, philosophical ideas, and the strangely comforting way Egyptians blended magic with practical life. Each topic merges gently into the next, like ripples in the Nile merging into a wider current. Let's begin with something Egyptians cherished deeply: the idea of sacred speech. Words were not casual in Egypt. They carried weight. They shaped reality. They were believed to possess Heka, the same divine force that powered creation. Saying something correctly mattered. Pronouncing a name mattered. Even silence had meaning. Priests trained for years to recite rituals with steady precision, their voices rising and falling like soft waves. Every sound echoed in temple halls that amplified the message just enough to feel sacred. Sacred speech wasn't about excitement. It was about connection. In tombs, spells were written with meticulous care. Each hieroglyph was a tiny, sacred being. Some spells instructed the deceased on polite ways to greet gods, which is possibly the most Egyptian thing imaginable, even in the afterlife. Good manners mattered. This brings us naturally to the concept of names, or the Ren. Egyptians believed a person's name carried their essence. If your name was spoken, you continued to exist spiritually. That's why names appear on tombs, statues, stelae, papyrus scrolls, and amulets. Erasing a name, damnatio memorio, was the most severe punishment imaginable, because it removed a soul from the cycle of eternity. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but they preferred that drama to stay quietly carved in stone, rather than acted out in real life. Now we move slowly into the world of sacred tools. We've touched on wands and incense, but the toolkit was much larger. Ritual vessels made of alabaster held offerings. Spoons carved into shapes of swimming women or lotus flowers held ointments. Scepters symbolized authorities, some shaped like flails, some like staffs, some like war scepters with animal-headed tops. These objects weren't used with force. They were symbols meant to maintain cosmic balance. A war scepter didn't strike anyone. It reminded everyone that order rested in gentle, steady hands. Even more symbolic was the ankh, the sign of life. People carried ankhs, carved them, painted them, wore them. Gods held ankhs in depictions, offering the symbol to kings. The ankh represented breath, sunlight, water, the beating of the heart. A small symbol with a large presence. You can almost imagine Egyptians sighing contentedly every time they carved one. Let's drift now into the idea of the temple roof. Many temples were built with stairways leading upward. Priests climbed at specific times to observe stars, conduct rituals, or simply align themselves with Nut's sky body. The roof was considered a sacred boundary halfway between earth and sky, a place of transition. Standing there in the quiet of early morning, with the desert stretching far and the Nile glowing faintly, must have felt like standing on the very skin of the universe. From the roof, priests watched planets, constellations, and the moon. Each celestial body had meaning. Orion was linked to Osiris, Sirius to Isis. The circumpolar stars, which never set, symbolized eternal souls. Egyptians didn't view the sky with anxiety. They saw it as a reassuring clock, predictable, balanced, stable. Their calendars reflected this, aligning religious festivals with sidereal events. If a star rose later than expected, the priests didn't panic. They simply adjusted their observations and kept the rituals steady. Let's move into something even more subtle, the concept of purity. Purity in Egypt wasn't moral perfection. It was ritual readiness. Priests shaved all body hair, including eyebrows, to maintain purity. They bathed multiple times a day. They avoided certain foods before rituals. None of these practices were about fear. They were about respect, approaching the sacred with a clear, quiet state of being. Ordinary people practiced their own forms of purity, washing before meals, cleaning shrines, offering clean water to gods or ancestors. Cleanliness wasn't an obsession. It was a gentle habit, a reminder of cosmic order. Now let's drift toward the idea of shadow. The shut, another spiritual part of a person. Egyptians believed the shadow had its own presence, its own importance. A shadow walked with you, followed you, protected you. It wasn't frightening. It was a quiet companion. In tomb art, shadows appear behind figures, calmly reinforcing identity. We move now toward one of the most delicate Egyptian concepts, the Ankh, the blessed transfigured spirit. Becoming an ACA wasn't guaranteed. It required moral living, proper mummification, correct burial rites, and the recitation of spells. Once transformed, the OC could travel freely between realms, shine like a star, join Ra on his solar boat, visit the living, or rest in the field of reeds. The OC wasn't a ghost or a hazy spirit. It was a perfected existence cert, bit like reaching an eternal state of being pleasantly productive without ever feeling tired. Let's explore the field of reeds more deeply, because Egyptians held this vision close to their hearts. They didn't imagine heaven as a cloud-filled paradise. They imagined a perfected Egypt, canals full of fish, fields full of grain, palm trees swaying, cool breezes drifting through reed marshes, and gentle sunlight warming everything. People plowed fields not out of necessity, but as an act of harmony. They feasted, talked, rested, and lived in eternal contentment. No fear, no pain, no chaos, just the ideal version of home. The field of reeds wasn't earned through heroic deeds. It was granted to those who lived with Mat, truth, fairness, kindness. The Egyptians valued everyday goodness over dramatic righteousness. Helping a neighbor mattered. Being honest mattered. Not stealing bread mattered. Even speaking gently mattered. Their afterlife was shaped by their cultural appreciation for calm, stable living. Let's drift now toward the idea of gates. Egyptian texts describe the deceased passing through multiple gates in the afterlife, each guarded by deities with long, elaborate names. These guardians didn't attack the soul. They simply asked it to identify itself and recite specific information. A bit like spiritual border control, but more ceremonial. If the deceased answered correctly, they passed through. If not, well, the texts skipped that part politely. Egyptians focused more on success than failure. The gates symbolized stages of transformation. Passing through each gate meant the soul grew more luminous. The Egyptians didn't fear these gates. They saw them as spiritual checkpoints guiding the dead toward peace. Now let's drift toward the idea of offerings again, this time focusing on food and drink. Offerings weren't meals in the modern sense. They were symbolic acts. Bread represented sustenance. Beer represented joy. Meat represented abundance. Water represented purification. Flowers represented beauty. Incense represented communication. These offerings were arranged neatly, presented calmly, and recited with formulaic phrases. Even the phrasing had a rhythm, almost like a quiet chant that helped priests maintain focus. Families performed similar offerings at home. A small loaf of bread, a cup of beer, a bowl of water, a sprig of herbs. These offerings maintained the bond between the living and the deceased. Egyptians believed the dead appreciated such gestures, not because they literally needed bread, but because remembrance itself was nourishment. Let's drift gently into another world, that of ancient Egyptian medicine. We touched on it before, but there's more to explore. Medical papyri show Egyptians categorized illnesses into two broad types: those caused by physical issues and those caused by spiritual or supernatural disturbances. For physical problems, they used herbs, oils, honey, and minerals. For spiritual issues, they used spells, amulets, and rituals. The division wasn't strict. A doctor might prescribe both a herbal remedy and a protective charm. Egyptians didn't see this as contradictory. They saw it as thorough. Some remedies were surprisingly sophisticated. Honey as an antibacterial agent, willow bark for pain relief, castor oil for digestive issues. The Ebers Papyrus lists hundreds of treatments. Some sound strange today, but many were effective. Healing wasn't rushed. Doctors took their time, mixing remedies carefully, observing patients with calm interest, and maintaining the same gentle confidence seen across all Egyptian practice. Now let's drift toward the theme of rebirth, which appears everywhere in Egyptian thought. Rebirth wasn't dramatic. It was slow, cyclical, timeless. Every sunrise was a rebirth of Ra. Every lotus flower opening was a symbol of rebirth. Every grain sprouting in fields was a sign of Osiris renewing the land. Life renewed itself constantly. Death wasn't seen as an end. It was seen as a transition into a new rhythm. This belief shaped their art. Tomb paintings show the dead receiving water from Hathor, walking among orchards, smelling lotus flowers, or sitting beneath trees. The atmosphere is always peaceful. No rushing, no tension. Just an eternal afternoon filled with soft colors and gentle breezes. Let's now wander into the realm of temple libraries. These were called pank houses of life. Texts were copied, studied, stored, and organized with care. Students trained in writing, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and ritual. Libraries kept knowledge alive, sometimes for centuries. Priests treated texts with quiet reverence. They weren't reading for entertainment. They were preserving cosmic order. Now we drift into the world of symbolism against specifically colors. Each color carried meaning. Blue represented sky and water. used in depictions of gods and sacred beings. Green represented growth and renewal, tied to Osiris and vegetation. Red symbolized power and complexity, sometimes chaos, sometimes energy. Yellow represented the flesh of the gods, especially in statues and coffins. Black symbolized fertility and the rich soil of the Nile, as well as regeneration. Colors weren't used randomly. They communicated ideas quietly, without needing explanation. Let's drift slowly into the topic of sacred landscapes. Egyptians believed certain locations were naturally infused with divine energy. The cliffs at Deir el-Bahar, the island of Elephantine, the oases of the Western Desert, the granite quarries of Aswan. These places shaped myth and memory. Pilgrims visited them, seeking blessings or simply the quiet comfort of divine presence in the land. Now we turn gently to a topic that reveals much about Egyptian worldview: the relationship between humans and gods. Egyptians didn't believe gods demanded dramatic devotion. They believed gods appreciated consistency. Daily rituals mattered more than grand gestures. Maintaining mattered more than elaborate sacrifices. The relationship was mutual. Gods protected humans, and humans maintained divine order. The Egyptians believed the universe hummed with soft divine energy, not explosive, not chaotic, just steady. Their gods weren't loud overseers. They were calm companions, guides, and forces shaping the world gently. Everything: temples, tombs, festivals, rituals, beliefs reflected that gentle rhythm. Let's drift once more into the quiet expanse of ancient Egypt, where the world still moves at that same slow rhythm we've grown used to. The kind of rhythm that feels almost like breathings, steady, calm, unhurried. In this part of our long journey, we keep walking through the warm corridors of temples and the soft shadows of myths, entering deeper corners of Egyptian thought. Nothing here jolts or surprises. Everything unfolds in the same gentle, measured way the Egyptians themselves preferred. We begin this part with the idea of transformation, not just of the soul, but of the gods, the landscape, and even time itself. Egyptians believed transformation was not an event, but a process, like sunlight slowly shifting across a temple wall. They saw the universe as constantly renewing itself in small, subtle cycles. No dramatic restarts. No cosmic emergencies. Just quiet, eternal recalibration. One of the clearest examples of this kind of transformation appears in the story of the sun. Ra traveled across the sky during the day, growing older as the hours passed. In the evening, he entered the western horizon. Slipping into the duat there, he joined with Osiris, the god of death and rebirth, to renew his strength. The two gods became one being for a moment, Osiris. This fusion wasn't dramatic or violent. It was a peaceful merging, like two currents blending into a single wider river. At dawn, Ra rose again, transformed into Khepri, the scarab, pushing the sun disk gently into place, as if beginning the world anew. This idea that death feeds life, and life feeds death appears everywhere in Egyptian thought. It's not morbid. It's simply balanced. They watched plants grow after the flood. They watched stars vanish and return. They watched their children grow while elders passed. Everything moved in cycles. Egyptian gods didn't break cycles. They maintained them. Let's move from cosmic cycles to something more tangible: the geography of temples. Egyptian temples weren't randomly placed. They were aligned with astronomical events, oriented toward sacred hills placed near water, or built on sites believed to carry divine memories. When you visit ancient temple sites, you notice how carefully everything sits within the landscape. Temples look as though they sprouted from the earth rather than being built upon it. For example, Karnak aligns with the winter solstice. On that day, sunlight travels straight down the main axis of the temple, touching the sanctuary at dawn. No fireworks, no crowd applause, just sunlight moving slowly through stone halls, as if performing a ritual of its own. Egyptians did this intentionally. They used architecture to bring cosmic events into daily experience. Temple roofs often had staircases leading upward. Priests climbed to perform rituals at dawn or dusk. They watched stars from these rooftops, reading the sky like a calendar. The air was quiet up there, with only the faint sounds of the city bellow boats on the Nile, cattle calling, palms rustling softly. It was the perfect place for observing the slow, steady movements of the cosmos. Now let's drift into the world of ritual offerings again. But from a more philosophical angle. Egyptians believed offerings were not bribes. They weren't meant to feed the gods, impress them, or convince them of anything. Instead, offerings maintained balance between humans and the divine. By giving bread, incense, water, and flowers, people acknowledged their place within the cosmic system. The gods returned blessings through sunlight, water, fertility, and protection. It was a reciprocal relationship, but one carried out with quiet mutual respect. Offerings were arranged neatly. Nothing in Egyptian ritual was messy. Bowls were aligned, bread was stacked evenly. Water was poured with controlled movements. Even the gestures of priests, their hands, their footsteps, the tilt of their heads followed patterns. Ritual wasn't a performance. It was a form of meditation. Let's drift into the heart of funerary practices again, exploring items placed inside tombs that served symbolic roles. We've mentioned shabtis before, those small figurines meant to work for the deceased in the afterlife. But there were other items too. There were headrests, carved from wood or stone, meant to keep the head elevated just as in life. They believed comfort should extend into eternity. There were small wooden boats, symbolizing safe travel. There were miniature granaries, ensuring an eternal supply of food. There were canopic chests to protect the organs, now safely under the watch of the 4 sons of Horus. And there were amulets, often dozens of them, each representing protection, healing, or transformation. These amulets weren't random trinkets. Their placement in the wrappings followed a specific pattern. One amulet protected the throat, another the chest, another the legs. The process was meticulous. Priests followed written instructions from the Book of the Dead or other texts. The deceased wasn't simply buried. They were wrapped in layers of symbolism, each piece gently placed, like careful reminders that the universe would remain orderly even in death. Now let's drift toward the idea of ritual drama, but not drama in the theatrical sense. Egyptians reenacted certain myths during festivals, but always in a calm, ceremonial manner. Movements were slow. Voices were measured. Costumes were symbolic rather than elaborate. One of the most important dramas was the Osiris festival at Abydos. Participants reenacted the story of Osiris's death and resurrection. It wasn't performed as a thrilling spectacle. Instead, it was a quiet affirmation that life could rise from death. People watched priests perform small gestures, carry statues, chant hymns, and in doing so, they believed they were helping renew the world's balance. Another ritual involved lighting lamps to guide the deceased. Families placed lamps at tomb entrances, letting the gentle glow reach into the darkness. It was a simple act of reassurance, nothing more dramatic than leaving a small light for someone traveling along an uncertain path. Now let's wander into the realm of temple staff, because not everyone in temples was a priest. There were scribes, gardeners, bakers, brewers, laundry workers, potters, musicians, dancers, guards, and builders. Temples were small cities, each part functioning quietly to support ritual life. Gardeners tended sacred trees and pools. Bakers prepared large quantities of bread for offerings. Musicians practiced their steady rhythms. Temple workshops produced incense, pottery, linens, and statues. The atmosphere must have been one of quiet industry, a place where everyone understood their role. Let's drift now to the subject of sacred barks, those ceremonial boats used to carry gods during festivals. These barks were placed in shrines and carried on the shoulders of priests. When they traveled through streets or sailed across the Nile, people followed with reverent awe, not loud cheering, not frantic shouting, just soft chants, clapping, and offerings along the route. The bark symbolized the god traveling among the people, blessing the land with their presence. On the river, the bark glided gently, the water lapping softly against its wooden sides. Priests stood with careful posture. Sunlight sparkled on the waves. The entire procession felt more like a meditative walk than a parade. Now let's wander into the philosophical core of Egyptian religion, the idea of divine immanence. Egyptians believed that gods existed both in the sky and in the world itself. A god could be present in a statue, a sacred animal, a ritual, a celestial event, or a natural feature. Gods weren't locked in one form. They moved through existence the way light moves through a room, touching different surfaces in different ways. This leads us to the idea of hidden. Amen, for example, was called the Hidden One. His essence was invisible, yet his presence was everywhere. People prayed to him quietly, without expecting visions or dramatic signs. They believed he guided hearts and minds in subtle ways. A successful crop, a peaceful year, a steady flood. These were the signs of divine favor, simple, undramatic, deeply appreciated. Let's drift now into domestic religion again, this time exploring household shrines in more detail. Even modest homes had small niches containing clay figures of gods or painted symbols. Offerings there were simple: a piece of bread, a few drops of water, a small bowl of beer. These shrines stayed active daily, not only during festivals. Families prayed for protection, health, and guidance. The gods weren't distant. They lived in the quiet corners of homes. Let's wander next into Egyptian ethics again, focusing on one key idea: the negative confessions. These were recited in the afterlife during the weighing of the heart. Instead of declaring what good deeds they had done, Egyptians listed the wrongs they had not done. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. I have not polluted water. Their morality was based on avoidance of harm rather than dramatic virtue. A very calm kind of ethics, quiet, modest, realistic. Now let's drift toward the natural world once more. The desert wasn't just an empty place. It housed shrines, tombs, nomadic routes, and ancient quarries. But most importantly, it represented the realm of the dead and the place where the sun traveled at night. Egyptians respected the desert's silence. They placed cemeteries there, believing the quiet landscape fit the solemnity of death. The Nile, by contrast, was the domain of life. It carried boats, fish, papyrus, and silt. Gods like Komhopi and Sobek governed its waters. Every year, people waited calmly for the inundation, trusting the river to renew the land. Now let's gently drift toward something that shaped Egyptian religion deeply: memory. Egyptians valued memory as a sacred duty. Remembering someone kept their soul alive. Writing their name protected their identity. Carving scenes in tombs preserved their activities. Reciting prayers fed their memory wasn't nostalgia, it was spiritual maintenance. This memory extended to the gods too. Hymns, rituals, festivals, and stories kept divine presence strong. Egyptians believed forgetting a god weakened the cosmic balance. We stand again in a landscape shaped by calm belief. A world where gods move quietly. A world where rituals maintain order. A world where life and death are two sides of the same gentle cycle. Let's drift into the final stretch of this long, quiet journey through ancient Egypt. We've walked through temples lit by soft golden light, wandered across desert paths that stretch into forever, and sat beside the Nile listening to its slow voice. Everything has moved at a gentle pace, steady, unhurried, as if the entire world were content to exist in a state of eternal afternoon. In this last part, we settle into the deepest layers of Egyptian belief. Not the grand myths everyone remembers, but the soft, enduring thoughts beneath them, the philosophy that shaped their culture, the rituals that held their society together, and the calm worldview that stayed steady for thousands of years. We end not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the same quiet tone that guided the Egyptians themselves. Let's begin our final walk with the idea of divine presence in nature. Because Egyptians didn't separate the spiritual from the natural. To them, every landscape carried a message. The Nile was a god. The desert was a god. The breeze was a sign of Shu. The warmth of the sun was Ra's daily touch. Even the simple act of walking through reeds could feel sacred if you paid attention to the symbols. You can almost imagine an ancient Egyptian standing at sunrise, watching the horizon shift from deep blue to soft gold. They wouldn't rush. They would simply stand there, knowing the sun's rise was an act of creation repeating itself. For them, each dawn was a reminder that the universe remained in balance. No alarms required. Just a gentle reassurance. Now let's drift toward one of the most important Egyptian ideas, Mat. The principle at the center of everything. We've mentioned Mat many times, but this final part is where the concept deserves its full quiet moment. Mat wasn't a dramatic force. She wasn't a warrior goddess or the source of thunder. She was order, truth, balance, fairness, and stability. Even the gods relied on her. Egyptians believed Mat kept the universe functioning. She guided the floods, the stars, the seasons, the moral choices of humans, and the rituals of priests. When a king ruled justly, Mat flourished. When he didn't, well, things got less pleasant, but the Egyptians rarely described the details. They preferred to focus on what should happen, not what might go wrong. Mat appeared in the smallest actions, speaking politely, being honest in trade, treating family members fairly. Even sweeping a threshold was an act of respect. Egyptians didn't think you needed heroic achievements to live a moral life. You just needed steady, consistent goodness. In many ways, it's one of the most peaceful ethical systems ever imagined. Now we drift into another, deep layer, the relationship between humans and gods. Unlike in some mythologies, Egyptian gods didn't constantly interfere in human affairs. They didn't demand elaborate sacrifices or test people with dramatic trials. Instead, they maintained the world quietly, and humans helped by performing rituals. It was a partnership, not a hierarchy. People believed the gods appreciated offerings, but not because they needed food. They appreciated respect. A cup of water, a loaf of bread, a small figurine placed on a household shrine. These gestures created harmony. Egyptians didn't try to bribe their gods. They simply honored them with small, steady acts. Now let's drift toward the theme of cosmic order, a topic that fascinated Egyptian priests. They saw the universe as a series of interlocking patterns: the cycle of the sun, the rise and fall of the Nile, the stars rotating around the pole, the phases of the moon, the growth of crops. All of these patterns reflected divine logic. Egyptians didn't obsess over chaos. They recognized it, respected it, and accepted it as part of the world. Seth, the god of storms, wasn't exiled from the pantheon. He stood proudly among the gods, representing necessary forces. Even storms belonged in the cosmic system. Egyptians believed you couldn't have sunlight without shadow. Their worldview was impressively Mikono. Need to pretend the world was simpler than it was. Now we'll drift toward the idea of rebirth, which stands at the heart of Egyptian thought. Rebirth appeared everywhere, in the rising sun, in the sprouting of crops, in the hatching of birds, in the turning of seasons, and of course, in the afterlife. Egyptians didn't fear death. They prepared for it with calm acceptance, almost like someone preparing for a long journey. Their burial practices weren't morbid. They were acts of care. Wrapping the body in linen was like tucking someone in for eternity. Painting tomb walls with peaceful scenes wasn't decoration. It was hope, optimism, and comfort. Even the smallest grave goods carried intention. A bowl of food, a jar of beer, a wooden headrest, a small figurine. These items weren't grand. They were familiar. Egyptians wanted the afterlife to feel like home. Now let's drift to another quiet feature of their worldview: the value of memory. Egyptians believed memory was a form of life. As long as someone remembered you, spoke your name, cared for your tomb, or read your inscriptions, your soul remained strong. This belief turned families into caretakers of eternity. Visiting a tomb wasn't spooky. It was thoughtful. A chance to pour water for one's ancestors. A chance to keep the thread between generations from unraveling. Names were carved everywhere. On statues, stele, coffins, walls, and even everyday items. Not for vanity, for survival. Egyptians believed forgetting someone was the true death. So families, scribes, and priests protected names with a seriousness that feels touching. Even today, now let's drift toward the topic of ritual cycles. Because Egyptians timed their rituals to match the natural world. Morning rituals honored the rising sun. Evening rituals honored its rest. New moons, full moons, solstices, and star risings shaped temple calendars. Priests didn't rush through these ceremonies. They moved slowly, reciting each phrase carefully, as if the universe depended on their calm voices. Festivals were moments when the divide between gods and humans softened. Statues of gods were carried outside temples, sailed across the river, or paraded through streets. People followed with quiet devotion. Musicians played steady rhythms. Dancers moved gracefully. Families offered flowers and small prayers. Even children sensed the significance of these moments. Festivals weren't wild celebrations. They were peaceful, shared experiences, gentle reminders that the gods walked among them. Let's wander now into another area: priestly knowledge. Priests weren't only ritual specialists. Many were scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, and philosophers. They wrote treatises on medicine, created surgical tools, developed calendars, studied stars, and maintained libraries. But they didn't publish their knowledge dramatically. They passed it down through apprenticeships, training each new generation with patience. Some priests specialized in dream interpretation. Some read omens. Some maintained temple accounting. Some taught scribes. Each had a role in keeping society calm and orderly. The Egyptian priesthood was less about spiritual power and more about responsibility, consistent and grounded in practical knowledge. Now we drift toward the idea of divine multiplicity, one of the most beautiful and complex parts of Egyptian theology. Gods could merge, split, transform, and change names depending on their roles. Amen could become Amen. Horus could merge with Sobek. Hathor could take the fierce form of Sekhmet. This wasn't confusing to the Egyptians. To them, gods were multi-layered beings who adapted to circumstances. Human identity was also layered. Egyptians believed each person had multiple spiritual parts: Sukkah, Ba, Ark, Ren, Shadow, and more. A single human life involved many forms working together, just as a single god could appear in many aspects. This layered thinking gave Egyptians a flexible, thoughtful way of understanding existence. They didn't force everything into rigid boxes. They allowed complexity to feel natural. Now, let's move to a quieter corner of Egyptian belief: domestic spirituality. Homes had small altars, lamps, and figurines. Families included ancestors in daily life. Mothers prayed to Tauret and Base during childbirth. Farmers whispered thanks to Renenutet during harvest. Sailors prayed to Sobek before voyages. Even simple chores, cooking, washing, grinding grain, felt connected to the sacred. Children grew up surrounded by gentle symbolism. They wore protective amulets. They heard bedtime stories about gods in forms of animals. They learned early that the world was full of meaningful patterns. Let's drift now into philosophical writings, especially the wisdom texts. We touched on Hotep, but other texts also shaped Egyptian thought. The instruction of Amenemop teaches patience, humility, and inner peace. It advises avoiding anger, rejecting greed, and focusing on calm living. Better is bread with a peaceful heart than wealth with anxiety, it says. A very Egyptian sentiment. These texts weren't dramatic lectures. They were collections of gentle advice, written by people who believed wisdom should be steady and moderate. You won't find many intense lines or bold declarations, just thoughtful reminders to live with balance. Now we drift toward one of the most comforting Egyptian ideas: eternal companionship. Egyptians believed no one traveled into the afterlife alone. Family members, ancestors, gods, and protective spirits accompanied the deceased. Even the prayers written in tombs acted as companions, soft voices guiding the soul through unfamiliar pathways. The Book of the Dead includes spells that say, essentially, you won't be alone. You will be guided. You will be welcomed. You will be safe. It's a peaceful message, and one that reflects a culture deeply committed to kindness. Let's drift once more through the field of reeds. In this ideal afterlife, people lived in harmony. They farmed because it felt satisfying. They fished because it brought joy. They lounged under sycamore trees, shaded by Hathor's presence. They reunited with loved ones. They ate bread and drank beer. The world felt familiar, calm, and perfect. No stress, no deadlines, no fear, just endless, gentle contentment. Now we reach the final stretch of this long journey. We've followed the Egyptians through creation myths, cosmic cycles, sacred rituals, funerary traditions, household worship, divine symbolism, temple life, and moral philosophy. And through it all, one idea has remained steady. Egyptian religion wasn't about fear or excitement. It was about harmony. The Egyptians built a worldview around balance between gods and humans, life and death, order and disorder, sky and earth. They didn't try to control the universe. They learned to move with it. Their gods weren't tyrants. They were quiet guardians. Their rituals weren't spectacles. They were steady reminders of connection. Their afterlife wasn't alien. It was familiar. As we step back from this ancient landscape, imagine once more the warm glow of the desert sunset. The temple stands silent. The river reflects soft ribbons of gold. Palm trees sway gently. And somewhere, a priest finishes closing a shrine for the night, placing the statue of a god into peaceful darkness until dawn. We end our journey the same way. The Egyptians ended each day with stillness, trust, and quiet confidence that the cycle will continue, just as it always has.